You take out the trash. Then you can go to the movies with your girly friend. It's kind of a joke. Okay. That's probably the goofiest thing I could ever think of writing down there. To try to get your attention somewhat, but it's an if-then statement. This first part is called your hypothesis. Something I can help you with, Chris? Appreciate your honesty. And this is your conclusion. So the first part is your what? The second part is your conclusion. Now that's hard. Pretty easy concept. What happens if you don't take out the trash? You don't get to go to the movies with your girly friend. Okay, we'll say girlfriend. All right. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we're going to represent these. What we usually say is if P, then Q. You guys remember that? Or the other way we'll write is we'll say P, then we'll draw an arrow, and then we'll say Q. This means if P, then Q. What have I told you? Mathematicians are lazy. We want to be able to abbreviate things. We want to be able to write a concept without having to write a bunch of junk down or a bunch of words. So what is the P in this case? It's your what? Hypothesis. In this case, the Q is your what? Okay. What we're going to have is a bunch of different, you're going to have a conditional. Q. Then we're going to have something called what do you think that means? Could you guys say the converse of this statement? Nope. If you go to the movies with your girlfriend, then what? You took out the trash. Isn't that just flipping it? See how it Q? See, once you start your conditional from this point on, excuse me, this is P and this is what? In this first case, in the conditional, the P is my hypothesis. But in the converse, I've made my P the what?
The conclusion.
And the Q my? We're going to have one called, and they love to give problems like this on a ACT, SAT end of instruction, even though we probably won't deal with it much after this. The inverse. Well, guess what? The inverse is almost the same as your conditional, except pretty much exactly the opposite. It's kind of a weird thing to say, isn't it? Pretty much the same, but exactly the opposite. In other words, what does this little sign mean? What did we learn in the last section? The opposite of it, right? The not. So, What do you think the inverse with this statement would be? If you do not take out the trash, then you get what? Cannot go to the movies with your girlfriend? Right? It is that simple. Okay? And the last thing, contrapositive. What would your guess be here? Kind of forming a pattern a little bit. That flipped. Not Q and not P. It's the converse of the inverse, isn't it?
Yeah.
So important you guys remember those names. Because like I said, there's something that inverse usually means opposite, right? Converse and contrapositive. The cons are flipping the hypothesis and conclusion of the previous, right? Converse is flipping your conditional statement. Contrapositive is flipping your what? Inverse. Okay? One thing that confused some people is the truth table that goes with these. For those of you that were trying to do this when we were doing truth tables before, maybe you've done this before and it made some sense, but basically you could have that true and this true, right? Everyone agree? This true and this what? This false and this true. And this false, and this false. And here's the weird part. When both of them are true, this is true. Now that's this column is the weird part, not that particular one. When your hypothesis is true, but what they say should happen ends up being false, then the whole statement is false. Believe it or not, when the hypothesis happens and the conclusion does happen, it's actually a true statement. Because the conclusion happened, right? And when they're both false, guess what? It's true. Kind of weird, huh? If you think about it, it's not. The last one may be the one that throws you. But oh, I'm sorry, I had that. Yeah, I had that. And notice that when the hypothesis, basically when this is false, because we don't know whether that should happen or not, this is always true. It's when the hypothesis happens and the conclusion ends up being false that we say the whole statement's false. Okay? So true, false is the only way that a conditional is completely false. We're not going to delve on that very much. Everybody get your little red books out. We'll just do some examples real quick. There's not a whole lot to this. And this is some teaching on how I expect it to be done on your paper. Guess what? See all of this right here? Do I make you write directions down like this? No. I'm only crossing it out because you have it on yours. So this is what your paper should look like. This is the number one, and that's the problem. They want us to find the hypothesis and conclusion. All you have to do on these is write this out word for word. Then do what I did. Put a box around this and write an H above it. For what? Then put a box around this and write what? For conclusion. This is the only assignment that I don't want you to abbreviate. Now you can use the angle sign instead of writing the word angle out. You can do things like that, but I want all of the statement written out. You can use symbols to represent words. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if computer do not like, don't do things like that. Go ahead and write it out on this one. Like I said, this is, as you said, this is obviously pretty easy, isn't it? On number 2, what's the hypothesis? So I would box that in. I don't box in the if, do I? And that would be what? So this is what I should be looking at when I look at your paper, isn't it? Yep. Except instead of being typed, yours will be written out. And you will have spaces between them so I can differentiate one from the other, please. Okay. Now this is sometimes something that messes with people a little bit. Write each in if-then form. Remember that the conclusion is what happens. Okay, so first this happens, then as a result the conclusion happens. So when I say a polygon with 4 sides is a quadrilateral, what would be my if? What's the condition? What happens first? It's a polygon has 4 sides. Then what? Problem, answer, right? So I should see both there, correct? An acute angle has a measure less than 90 degrees. How would I write that in if-then form?
If it's an acute angle,
If,
then it has a measure of less than 90.
okay, so if an angle is acute, then what? Its
Less than 90.
measure is less than 90 degrees. Problem? Answer. Guys, can it be any more self-explanatory that I'm putting it on video and going to post it of how you should write the problems and put your answers? Determine the truth value of each conditional statement. If true, explain your reasoning. If false, give a counterexample. If you have $5, then you have 5 $1 bills. To basically, for an if-then statement, if this is true, and you can give any example that makes this false, then the statement's false. Can you give an example to where this happens and this is false? You can. And what is your counterexample? So you're going to say false. Your counterexample is what? Had a what? $5 bill? Or $5 in quarters? It doesn't matter. But all you need is what? How many counterexamples? One. So remember, when we're talking about true-false statements with a conditional statement, the only time they're ever false is when the first part's true, and you can find an example when the second part is what? False. So, if I roll two six-sided dice and sum of the numbers is 11, then one die must be 5. Can you think of a time when this is true and that's false? Can't, can you? To get, how would I explain that? To get 11, it would have to be 6 and 5 or 5 and 6. Is that a good way to explain it? You kind of put the only possibilities there were. Because you can't do 7 and 4 because there is no, really? I'm going to separate you two. We're doing things in this book. Why wouldn't that book be out and open to the correct page? I'll either pick a new place for you. You guys pick it for yourselves. One of the two. If two angles are supplementary, then one of the angles is acute. Okay, you got two angles that have to add to what? 180. Is there any chance of having a 91 and 91 add to 180? If one of them is over 90, what does the other have to be? So that's true. Right? Well, that's true. Good job. False. 90 degrees plus what? 90 degrees is supplementary. Very good. You guys ready to get started? Or do I need to do this one for you, right? You guys can do converse, inverse, contrapositive, all that stuff, can't you? Okay, let's do